Now we read back in Exodus during the giving of the law. This is Exodus 30, starting in verse 11. It says, "Then the Lord said to Moses, when you take a census of the Israelites to count them, each one must pay the Lord a ransom for his life at the time he is counted. Then no plague will come on them when you number them. Each one who crosses over to those already counted is to give a half shekel, according to the sanctuary shekel, which weighs 20 gerahs, whatever that means. This half shekel is an offering to the Lord. All who cross over," now in this case, they're talking specifically about crossing over into the Promised Land, because they're not in the Promised Land yet. But presumably this law would still apply anytime you took a military census of the people, which is what David is doing here. "Those 20 years old or more," that's fighting age, "are to give an offering to the Lord. The rich are not to give more than half a shekel, and the poor are not to give less, when you make the offering to the Lord to atone for your lives. Receive the atonement money from the Israelites, and use it for the service of the tent of meeting," or the temple, as David is trying to make preparations to build. "It will be a memorial for the Israelites before the Lord, making atonement for your lives." So David is conducting a military census here. I'm not entirely clear if he should have followed those rules. I suppose so. That rule that God gave Moses in Exodus 30 is specifically in the context of them crossing over into the Promised Land and giving a shekel for themselves at that time. But it also seems as though, it says, verse 12, Exodus 30, "When you take a census of the Israelites to count them," maybe that applies to any time you take a census of them. I'm not sure. I'm not clear on that. At any rate, it doesn't seem as though David did that. It doesn't seem as though he did take a shekel, or half a shekel. And maybe that's part of the problem here, is they didn't follow the proper procedure for taking a military census. I think also, like I said earlier, that David was boasting in his military might and not in the Lord, which was a problem. But we also read in that Exodus 30 passage that the penalty for improperly conducting a census was plague. And that's one of the three options that God has given David here. So if David is on top of things, he'll pick the plague, because that is actually the divinely prescribed penalty for this specific sin. And he says here, and starting again in verse 14, "David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let us fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men." So he does not want to spend 3 months on the run from his enemies. He knows what that's like, and does not want to do that again this time. He would much rather be at the mercy of the Lord than at the mercy of human enemies. I would be too. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel, which again is the divinely prescribed penalty for this particular sin. From that morning until the end of the time designated, which was, 3 days? 3 days of plague. And 70,000 of the people from Dan to Beersheba died. I don't know what kind of plague this was. It really doesn't honestly matter. When the angel stretched out his hand to destroy Jerusalem, so he's gone from Dan to Beersheba, and now he's come to Jerusalem, the Lord was grieved because of the calamity, and said to the angel who was afflicting the people, "Enough! Withdraw your hand." So the Lord did in fact show mercy. David was right to count on the Lord's mercy, because he did in fact show mercy. After he had already struck down 70,000 people. That's true. So those 100,000, or AC here, where were we? 800,000 plus 500,000, where am I here? Yeah, 800,000 plus 500,000, which is 1,300,000. So of those, 70,000 of them aren't around anymore. So he did show mercy, but only after 70,000 of them died. The angel of the Lord was then at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. Now remember, Jerusalem was originally a Jebusite city. So this is someone who apparently has survived the invasion of David into Jerusalem and has been allowed to stay here, apparently. Maybe he was a sympathizer of David. Maybe he was a convert. I don't know. But he's a Jebusite in a formerly Jebusite city, so apparently he survived the takeover. When David saw the angel, so the angel was visible, who was striking down the people, he said to the Lord, I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? Let your hand fall upon me and my family. Hold me guilty. I'm the guilty one here. Hold me accountable, not these people. They were innocent. On that day, Gad went to David and said to him, Go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up as the Lord had commanded through Gad. When Araunah looked and saw the king and his men coming out toward him, he went out and bowed down before the king with his face to the ground. Araunah said, Why has my lord the king come to his servant? To buy your threshing floor, David answered, so that I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague of the people may be stopped. Araunah said to David, Let my lord the king take whatever pleases him and offer it up. Here are oxen for the burnt offering, and here are threshing sledges and ox yokes for the wood. O king, Araunah gives all this to the king. Araunah also said to him, May the Lord your God accept you. So he was prepared to give this stuff to the king. But the king is here to buy it, not to take it. But the king replied to Araunah, No, I insist on paying you for it. I will not sacrifice to the Lord my God burnt offerings that cost me nothing, because it is not a sacrifice. If you're giving God something that didn't cost you anything to get, you're not giving him anything. So David bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. That is about 1 1/4 pounds, according to my footnotes down there. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. Then the Lord answered prayer on behalf of the land, and the plague on Israel was stopped. That's the end of 2 Samuel. But we have a lot more to read about that in the last chapters of 1 Chronicles. So let's move on to 1 Chronicles account, 1 Chronicles 21, and read about its account of this incident and then a lengthy aftermath to that. It has a slightly different version, or slightly different perspective on the events themselves here. We already read about the first one with the change in language between God inciting David and Satan inciting David. And there's a different perspective, some details added about some of this later stuff too, as we'll read about here in 1 Chronicles 21. Satan rose up against Israel and incited David to take a census of Israel. So David said to Joab and the commanders of the troops, Go and count the Israelites from Beersheba to Dan. Then report back to me so I may know how many there are. But Joab replied, May the Lord multiply his troops 100 times over. My lord the king, are they not all my lord's subjects? Why does my lord want to do this? Why should he bring guilt on Israel? So Joab knows this is a bad idea. I mean, for practical purpose, Joab, we read about him, he's been around since the beginning of David. He's been with David the whole time. He actually outlives David even. And Joab is a handful. He is a very strong-armed individual. Clearly believes in God, believes in Jehovah. It's hard to say exactly how devout he is, but clearly he does believe in him. He has faith in him. I'm not going to take that away from him. I think he does. I think he has a very much a look out for number one sort of attitude. But he is, I believe, a faithful Israelite who does believe in the Israelite God. I think very wholeheartedly. He's also a very practical man, a very pragmatic, practical man. Like I said, looks out for number one. He would know probably that this is against God's will to do this, and he probably would also know, probably be even more aware, being the very practical, pragmatic man that he is, he would be very aware that this would not be a popular thing to do with the people either, because again, like I said earlier, they probably would take this as though, well, now we're getting signed up to go to war somewhere. David is preparing an invasion of some nation, and he's going to make me be on the front lines. It's not going to be something that the people are going to be fond of having to do either. So it's against the Lord's will, and it's against the people's will too. The king's word, however, overruled Joab. So Joab left and went throughout Israel, and then came back to Jerusalem. Joab reported the number of the fighting men to David. In all Israel there were 1,100,000 men who could handle a sword, including 470,000 in Judah. Those numbers are a little bit different. I have no idea why. I'm not particularly bothered by that. Numbers tend to be one of those things that get messed up in the copying process. The copies and the copies and the copies that we have all down the lines. It is true that during the course of time, some of these verses in the Old Testament did get corrupted due to copying or scribal errors. It is true. And a lot of the verses, a lot of the trouble spots have to do with lists of numbers. So maybe that's it. Maybe there's a distinction between fighting men and men who could handle a sword. Maybe the chronicler is exaggerating for the sake of making it seem more impressive, which in their day and time would not have been a problem. We might think of that as a historical problem, but in their day and time they would not have. So we just have to understand that too. I don't know. I don't know why there's a difference in the numbers, but frankly, this is not something that really is worth worrying about, frankly. There are any number of possible explanations. No one can say exactly which it is, but this is not something that should cause anybody any distress. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin, so he doesn't even include it. So now Levites are not fighting men, so they're not going to be included in the military census period. Apparently he didn't include Benjamin. Remember how we said that they were making a counterclockwise trip from Jerusalem out and around back to Jerusalem again? Well, Jerusalem is in Benjamite territory, so I guess they were going to end with Benjamin, and he didn't. I guess by the time he got there, he decided not to bother with it anymore. He was just done with it. He wasn't going to finish it. But Joab did not include Levi and Benjamin in the numbering because the king's command was repulsive to him. This command was also evil in the sight of God, so he punished Israel. Then David said to God, I have sinned greatly by doing this. Now, I beg you, take away the guilt of your servant. I have done a very foolish thing. The Lord said to Gad, David's seer, go and tell David, this is what the Lord says. I am giving you 3 options. Choose one of them for me to carry out against you. So Gad went to David and said to him, this is what the Lord says. Take your choice. Pick your poison. 3 years of famine, 3 months of being swept away before your enemies. Where am I? With their swords overtaking you, or 3 days of the sword of the Lord, days of plague in the land, with the angel of the Lord ravaging every part of Israel. Now then, decide how I should answer the one who sent me. David said to Gad, I am in deep distress. Let me fall into the hands of the Lord, for his mercy is very great, but do not let me fall into the hands of men. So the Lord sent a plague on Israel, and 70,000 men of Israel fell dead. So it agrees with the numbers there. And God sent an angel to destroy Jerusalem. But as the angel was doing so, the Lord saw it and was grieved because of the calamity, and said to the angel who was destroying the people, enough! Withdraw your hand. The angel of the Lord was then standing at the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. David looked up and saw the angel of the Lord standing between heaven and earth. So he was visible. He was visible to the human eye at this point in time, with a drawn sword in his hand extended over Jerusalem. I don't know how big this being was. Was he man-sized floating in the air? Was he giant-sized floating in the air? I don't know. But clearly he was visible. David saw this thing sitting, floating in the air somehow. Then David and the now of course this is the sort of thing that today we just would make our brains explode. We wouldn't ever possibly believe this would happen. But the text says that this thing was visible. The text says that David looked up and saw it. I wasn't there. Okay? I am not in a position to dispute that the text is accurate when it records that David saw this thing with his eyes. I was not there. I don't know what David saw or didn't see. I'm not in a position to say for certain to definitively say this couldn't have happened because I wasn't there to see it. Then David and the elders, clothed in sackcloth, fell face down. David said to God, "Was it not I who ordered the fighting men to be counted? I am the one who has sinned and done wrong. These are but sheep. What have they done? O Lord my God, let your hand fall upon me and my family, but do not let this plague remain on your people." Then the angel of the Lord ordered Gad. Now wait, so this is the angel of the Lord. This angel that was identified in the previous verses as being spoken to by God, apparently out of heaven somehow, is now in verse 16 and following identified as the angel of the Lord. So the angel of the Lord is receiving instructions from God out of heaven, apparently. But we've read elsewhere the angel of the Lord speaks first person as though he is God. In other instances we've read about this being, he identifies himself as God and speaks with the authority and in the name of God. In this case, it seems as though he's receiving instruction out of heaven from the voice of God. Then the angel of the Lord ordered Gad to tell David to go up and build an altar to the Lord on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite. So David went up in obedience to the word that Gad had spoken in the name of the Lord. He's going up probably because it's on top of a hill. This threshing floor, when they threshed their wheat, they threw stuff up in the air and let the wind blow the lighter, more useless chaff away from the heavier, good wheat, which would fall back down to the ground. So they're probably up in the air where they can catch more of a wind, up in the mountain where they can catch more of a wind. And this is the site where the temple will be built. It is going to be built on a mountain, so they're on top of a hill of some kind here. When Araunah was threshing wheat, he turned and saw the angel. So the angel is visible to him too. I guess he's like literally right above him practically. His 4 sons who were with him hid themselves. Then David, we didn't read about the sons. We didn't read about that in 2 Samuel. We didn't read about Araunah's response to the angel or about his sons. Then David approached, and when Araunah looked and saw him, he left the threshing floor and bowed down before David with his face to the ground. David said to him, "Let me have the site of your threshing floor so that I can build an altar to the Lord, that the plague on the people may be stopped. Sell it to me at full price." Araunah said to David, "Take it. Let my lord the king do whatever pleases him. Look, I will give the oxen for the burnt offering, the threshing sledges for the wood, and the wheat for the grain offering. I will give all this." Now Araunah is probably trying to curry favor with the king. He's probably offering to give this guy, the king, this stuff so that the king would look upon him with favor. I don't think he's trying to actually haggle a price here with the king. He does end up doing that, but my guess is that his first instinct is simply to give the king what the king is asking for in order to curry favor with the king. But the king is going to insist on paying full price, so when he does that, Araunah is going to get a price out of him. But my guess is that his first instinct is not to. But King David replied to Araunah, "No, I insist on paying the full price. I will not take for the Lord what is yours, or sacrifice a burnt offering that costs me nothing." So David paid Araunah 600 shekels of gold for the site. According to this, that's about 15 pounds of gold. David built. Now we read a little bit. That's written a little differently in 2 Samuel. In 2 Samuel, it says he bought the threshing floor and the oxen and paid 50 shekels of silver for them. Apparently, he had a separate price. Where were we? For the site itself. For the whole site, which was 600 shekels of gold. David built an altar to the Lord there and sacrificed burnt offerings and fellowship offerings. He called on the Lord, and the Lord answered him with fire from heaven on the altar of burnt offering. Then the Lord spoke to the angel, and he put his sword back in its sheath. So he's been standing there, floating there, I guess, with his sword sticking out in his hand. I'm sure his right hand. Pointed towards Jerusalem the whole time. At that time, when David saw that the Lord had answered him on the threshing floor of Araunah the Jebusite, he offered sacrifices there. The tabernacle of the Lord, which Moses had made in the desert, And the altar of burnt offering. Actually, you know what? I'm going to go ahead and stop right there. That was the equivalent, that was a parallel account in 1 Chronicles 21 of the account in 2 Samuel 24. 1 Chronicles is going to go on to give us a lot more information about what happens afterwards, but their similarities end right there.